Harley-Davidson walked into the US Patent and Trademark Office and tried to copyright a sound. Not a logo, not a word, a noise, the exhaust note of its own engines, and it named 9 competitors as thieves for building bikes that made the same rumble. That fight took 6 years to die. Today we're breaking down why Harleys sound like that in the first place, and why the new ones rolling off the line in Milwaukee don't sound like it anymore. Stay until the end, because the real answer isn't the exhaust pipe. It's not even the engine. It's something the company can't fix without breaking federal law. Here's the reframe. The potato sound was never a marketing choice. It's a mechanical accident that Harley spent a century turning into a religion. And it's now the single hardest thing in the entire motorcycle industry to legally reproduce. We're going to walk through every layer, from the smallest contributing factor to the one regulation sitting underneath the entire mess, so that by the end, you'll understand exactly why the bike in a 2026 showroom can share a nameplate with a bike from 1994 and still sound like a completely different machine. Number 7. The industry built entirely to undo Harley's own engineering. Start with the money, because it tells you how big this problem actually is. There is an entire secondary industry: Vance & Hines, Reinhardt, Bassani, S&S, Cobra, Dennis Kirk, TAB Performance, and dozens of smaller shops, whose core business model is reversing decisions Harley-Davidson's own engineers were legally required to make. Dennis Kirk alone stocks more than 2,100 separate Harley exhaust systems, parts, and slip-ons. That's not a niche accessory category. That's a parallel supply chain. Retailers selling into this space are blunt about why customers show up. RevZilla's own product copy tells buyers flat out that factory pipes are notoriously quiet in order to meet regulations, and that an aftermarket system will unlock that classic, deep Harley rumble the factory bike was never allowed to have. Read that again. A retailer is explicitly marketing its product as the fix for a problem the manufacturer was forced to create by law. That's an unusual position for an entire industry to build itself around. And it only exists because the gap between what the factory can legally sell and what riders actually want is wide enough to support thousands of SKUs. Owners aren't shy about why they're buying. In one Road Glide forum thread asking why people swap the exhaust at all, the consensus lands almost immediately on sound and looks, not horsepower. One rider put it plainly: nobody actually notices their bike getting faster after a slip-on swap, but everybody notices the sound, and the factory mufflers are, in their words, ugly and don't give much sound. A performance bump of maybe 8 to 10% gets marketed alongside these systems, but multiple riders in these same threads openly admit the real horsepower gain is negligible on a stock motor, small enough that you'd never feel it on public roads, since almost nobody's actually riding at redline on the highway. The pipe isn't about power, it's about restoring an identity the bike was built to obscure. That's the frame for everything that follows. This isn't a handful of extreme customizers going rogue. It's a mainstream, industry-scale, publicly advertised response to a regulatory reality that touches every single new Harley sold in America. Number 6. The patchwork of state noise laws nobody agrees on. Start here, because it's the part almost nobody explains right. There is no single American law that tells you how loud your Harley is allowed to be on the road. There's a federal manufacturing standard, which we'll get to, but once that bike leaves the dealership, enforcement becomes a 50-state mess of wildly inconsistent numbers. California still enforces an 80 decibel limit tied to a bike's manufacture year, but the same reporting that documents it also notes local police departments openly admitting they don't own a calibrated decibel meter. So the law exists on paper and nowhere else. New Hampshire's legal ceiling sat at a jaw-dropping 106 decibels for years, loud enough that state lawmakers eventually tried to slam it down to 84, the EPA recommended level, and got run over by biker advocacy groups who showed up in force to defend the right to be loud. Maryland splits the difference by manufacture date. Colorado has its own number. Connecticut has another. Translate that into plain terms. The same motorcycle, with the same pipes, is legal in Nashua and a ticket in Sacramento. Riders talk about this constantly in forums, planning road trips around which states they can safely open the throttle in. That's not a footnote. That's a rider genuinely recalculating a cross-country route around a sound. The human cost cuts both ways. Groups like New Hampshire Citizens Against Loud Motorcycles have organized specifically because a small share of extremely loud bikes make entire neighborhoods audible from blocks away every warm afternoon. One organizer put it simply, when the temperature clears 50 degrees, you can't hear yourself think. Bikers counter that a loud pipe is a safety feature, not a nuisance, a way to get seen, or in their words, heard, by drivers who aren't looking. Both sides have a point. Neither side has changed the other's mind in 30 years. What makes this genuinely frustrating for riders is the sliding scale hidden inside these state laws. Several states, including Connecticut and Colorado, grade their legal limits by manufacture year. 88 decibels for bikes built in the early 1970s, stepping down to 83 for mid-70s through mid-80s models, and landing at 80 for anything built after 1985. That means two Harleys parked next to each other at a rally, decades apart in age, can be operating under two entirely different legal ceilings, and a rider has to actually know their bike's manufacture date to know which number applies to them. Then there's the enforcement problem, which might be the biggest gap of all. A Berkeley, California police spokesperson admitted publicly that the department doesn't own a calibrated decibel meter. So instead of citing riders under the specific noise statute, officers fall back on a much vaguer catch-all requiring an adequate muffler in constant operation, leaving the definition of excessive or unusual noise almost entirely up to an individual officer's judgment on a given afternoon. That's not a law. That's a mood. And it means the actual on-road experience of riding a loud Harley has less to do with the number printed in the state code and everything to do with which department happens to pull you over. Number 5. The single-pin crankshaft that started all of this. Here's the part of the story that's actually beautiful, mechanically speaking, before regulation ever entered the picture. The potato-potato sound isn't a styling decision. It's a byproduct of a genuinely unusual engineering choice Harley has stuck with since the very beginning. Most V-twin engines from other manufacturers use offset crank pins, separate connection points for each piston, timed to fire at evenly spaced intervals, which produces a smoother, more conventional exhaust note. Harley did something almost nobody else committed to at scale. It put both pistons on a single, shared crankshaft pin, in a 45-degree V arrangement, firing off one shared ignition system. That's cheaper to manufacture. It's also mechanically imbalanced by design, because the geometry means the two cylinders can't fire at even intervals no matter what you do to them. The result is that uneven bang, 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 bang cadence, a firing order that's off rhythm because the engine is physically incapable of firing on rhythm. For most of Harley's history, the company didn't even use internal balance shafts to smooth it out. Those didn't show up until the Softail's solid-mounted frame forced Harley's hand around the 20,000 model year, because without dampening, that vibration would have shaken the bike itself apart. So the sound people spend thousands of dollars trying to recreate today started as a cost-saving shortcut from a different era of manufacturing, one that happened to produce a firing pattern nobody else wanted to copy, until everybody wanted to copy it. Translate that into plain terms, because single crank pin doesn't mean much until you picture it. Imagine two people trying to clap in rhythm, but one of them is tied to the other's wrist with a foot of slack rope. They can't clap evenly no matter how hard they try. One clap comes fast, the next drags a half beat behind, then the cycle resets. That uneven bang, 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 bang is exactly what you're hearing at idle. It's not a rhythm section. It's a mechanical stutter that happened to sound incredible coming out of a tailpipe. And it's worth sitting with how unusual that decision looks in hindsight. Competing manufacturers spent decades engineering their V-twins specifically to eliminate this kind of imbalance, because evenly spaced firing generally means less vibration, less mechanical stress, and a smoother ride. Harley kept the flaw because riders decided the flaw was the whole point. That's a strange kind of brand loyalty, an entire company built around not fixing something everyone else considered a defect. Number 4. The trademark fight Harley actually lost. By the early 1990s, that accidental sound had become the single most valuable piece of branding Harley-Davidson owned. More recognizable, arguably, than the Bar and Shield logo stitched on every jacket in the parking lot. So in 1994, the company tried to own it outright, legally, as intellectual property. The application described the exhaust sound of applicants' motorcycles, produced by V-twin, common crankpin motorcycle engines when the goods are in use, and named the sound as something competitors were illegally infringing on. Kawasaki, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Honda pushed back hard, arguing that any manufacturer building a V-twin cruiser with a similar architecture would naturally produce a similar sound, because it's physics, not branding. You can't trademark a firing order. The case dragged on for 6 years before Harley quietly withdrew the application in 2000, conceding the point without ever formally losing in court. But the fight itself tells you everything about how Harley saw this sound, not as an incidental feature of the engine, but as the actual product. The company was willing to spend 6 years and real legal money trying to lock competitors out of physics. That's not a business protecting a supply chain. That's a business protecting a feeling. Think about what that fight was actually asking a court to do. Harley wanted federal trademark protection for a specific mechanical firing pattern, essentially arguing that any manufacturer building a common crankpin 45-degree V-twin, regardless of engineering intent, was infringing on Harley's brand simply by using a similar architecture. Honda, in particular, had been chasing the American cruiser market hard in the early 1990s, and its engineers reportedly explored ways to replicate a Harley-like exhaust note on its own V-twins. From Harley's side, that wasn't flattery. It was a direct threat to the one thing a Japanese manufacturer with a reputation for reliability couldn't easily out-engineer: 40 years of acoustic brand recognition. The case never reached a final trademark ruling, but the underlying tension it exposed never actually went away. It just moved from a courtroom fight about who's allowed to make the sound to the regulatory fight we're getting into now, about whether anyone's allowed to make it at all, straight off the factory floor. Number 3. The Milwaukee-Eight changed the engine underneath the sound. This is where the story stops being about branding and starts being about hardware, because in 2017, Harley replaced its long-running twin-cam engine with the Milwaukee-Eight, and the switch altered the sound at a level no exhaust pipe can undo. The old twin-cam ran 2 exhaust valves per cylinder. The Milwaukee-Eight moved to 4 valves per cylinder, a genuinely better design for airflow, cooling, and power delivery. But more valves change the way exhaust gas actually exits the engine. Different pulse timing, different pressure waves hitting the header pipe. Riders and tuners in the HD forums community describe this bluntly. Getting a good traditional Harley growl out of the new 4-valve heads is fundamentally harder than it was on the old 2-valve twin-cam, no matter what pipe you bolt on. One longtime rider, after cycling through 3 different aftermarket slip-ons trying to chase the old tone, said flatly that it's just a different animal to tune. On top of the valve redesign, the Milwaukee-Eight also runs a single chain-driven camshaft and lighter internal valve train components, specifically engineered to cut mechanical clatter and vibration. Quieter by design, independent of the exhaust entirely. So riders trading in a twin-cam Road King for a new Milwaukee-Eight touring bike aren't just hearing a quieter exhaust. They're hearing a mechanically different engine architecture that was never going to replicate the old tone one-for-one. Pipes or no pipes. Here's the timeline that makes this land. Harley's big twin platform ran through the shovelhead, then the evolution starting in 1984, then the twin cam from 1999 through 2016. Each generation sounding subtly different from the last, but all sharing the same basic 2-valve breathing pattern that generations of owners had spent decades learning to tune by ear. Then, in 2017, in a single model year jump, Harley swapped the entire breathing architecture underneath its flagship touring lineup. That's not a running change, that's the equivalent of a completely different set of lungs on the same skeleton. Owners noticed immediately, and not always kindly. Across forum threads dedicated specifically to making your Milwaukee-Eight sound menacing, the recurring theme isn't which pipe to buy, it's how many pipes people have already tried and rejected before finding something close to acceptable. One writer described working through 3 different slip-on mufflers and moving on to a 4th, still chasing a tone the old twin cam gave up for free. That's real money and real frustration spent trying to out-tune a valve architecture on a bike that costs upward of $20,000 before a single aftermarket part goes on it. Number 2. The catalytic converter nobody wants to talk about. If the Milwaukee-Eight changed the character of the sound, the catalytic converter is what's actually strangling the volume. And it's the part of this story riders bring up most bitterly and most consistently across every forum thread on the subject. Modern Harley touring models run a catalytic converter integrated directly into the stock header pipe, required to keep the bike compliant with federal and increasingly strict European emissions standards. One longtime tuner summed up the entire owner community's frustration in one word when asked what's killing the classic tone: catalytic converters. It's not a subtle effect. The cat physically restricts exhaust flow and dampens the pressure pulses that create that low, aggressive rumble, while, as a side effect, owners frequently complain about dumping a noticeable amount of extra heat onto the rider's and passenger's legs, since the converter runs hot by design. This is why decatting, cutting the converter out of the header entirely, has become a fixture of Harley ownership culture, discussed openly and repeatedly across owner forums as one of the only ways to reliably recover the old growl on a Milwaukee-Eight. It typically comes paired with a professional tune to keep the fuel mapping correct once the restriction is gone. Riders report it as one of the few modifications that actually delivers what a slip-on muffler alone can't: real tonal change, not just volume. It also happens to be, in the letter of the law, tampering with certified emissions equipment on a public road, a federal violation under the Clean Air Act that owners perform anyway, in driveways and garages across the country, essentially on the honor system, because enforcement almost never reaches individual bikes. That gap between what's technically illegal and what's practically universal is the quiet undercurrent running through this entire industry. Nobody's hiding it. It's discussed in the open, in public forums, under real usernames, because the alternative is riding a bike that a huge share of the ownership community considers to sound wrong. The heat complaint is worth sitting with for a second, because it's not just a comfort issue, it's a direct, physical demonstration of how much work that converter is doing. Owners in Florida and other hot weather states describe stock headers running hot enough to burn bare skin on contact after a ride. Heat that friends with decatted bikes say simply isn't there anymore once the converter's gone. That's a catalytic converter, absorbing and radiating exhaust energy that would otherwise be doing two things: making noise and making the header pipe glow with that classic deep tone riders are chasing. Pull the cat, and both the heat and the restriction go down together, which is exactly why so many riders treat decat and tune as close to a rite of passage on a new Milwaukee-Eight touring bike, right up there with the first oil change. And the workaround culture around this has gotten sophisticated. Riders swap notes on which aftermarket header pipes flow best with the cat gone, how to fix the decel pop, a popping sound on deceleration that shows up once the converter's restriction disappears, and which tuning devices best remap the fuel curve to compensate. None of it requires special tools or a machine shop. It requires a wrench, an afternoon, and a willingness to quietly step outside EPA compliance, the same way hundreds of thousands of other owners already have. Number 1. The regulation Harley can't out-engineer. Here's the entry that ties every one of these threads together, and it's not a part on the bike at all. It's a federal noise standard that's been sitting quietly on the books since 1986, and it's the actual root cause of everything you just heard. Since 1986, EPA Regulation 40 CFR 205.152 has capped new motorcycle noise emissions at 80 decibels measured at 50 feet, a number the agency landed on after explicitly rejecting a stricter 78 decibel proposal because it decided the marginal public benefit didn't justify the added manufacturing cost. That number has not moved in almost 4 decades. Every design decision Harley has made since then, the catalytic converters, the internally quieted Milwaukee-Eight valve train, the smaller, more restrictive stock mufflers riders love to complain about, exists specifically to keep every single bike on the showroom floor under that 80 decibel ceiling, at the point of sale, every time, with zero legal wiggle room. And this is the part that should actually change how you think about the whole Harley went soft narrative. The company already tested how far it could bend that rule, and it got caught in the most expensive way possible. Starting in 2008, Harley manufactured and sold roughly 340,000 Screamin' Eagle Pro Super Tuner devices, aftermarket units that let owners modify their bike's emissions controls for more power and, not coincidentally, more sound. In 2016, the Department of Justice and the EPA came down on the company directly, calling the tuners illegal defeat devices under the Clean Air Act. Harley agreed to pay a $12 million civil penalty, spend another $3 million on air quality mitigation projects, stop selling the devices immediately, and buy back and physically destroy every unit still sitting in dealer inventory. The government additionally flagged more than 12,000 motorcycles Harley had sold that weren't properly certified under its own EPA paperwork. That's the ceiling. Harley-Davidson, the company that once tried to trademark a sound as its own intellectual property, got fined $15 million combined dollars for helping its own customers get that sound back. That's not a company that stopped caring about how its bikes sound. That's a company that got caught trying to have it both ways and has been playing strictly by the rules, publicly, ever since. Every quiet stock pipe rolling out of Milwaukee today is downstream of that settlement. Zoom out and the numbers alone tell the story better than any brand narrative could. 340,000 tuners sold since 2008. 12,600 motorcycles flagged as improperly certified. $12 million in civil penalties, plus another $3 million earmarked specifically for cleaning up pollution the tuners caused. That's not a rounding error in a corporate budget. That's a company that ran the numbers on how much it would cost to quietly give riders what they wanted, got caught, and paid a price steep enough to make sure it never tried that particular workaround again, on the record, at scale. And this is where the story loops all the way back to number 7. That regulatory ceiling, the one Harley itself can't legally push past, is precisely the vacuum the aftermarket industry rushed in to fill. Vance & Hines, Reinhardt, S&S, and every shop stocking 1,000 slip-ons aren't circumventing some obscure loophole. They're operating in the exact legal gray zone Harley got burned for stepping into directly, selling parts that let an individual owner do, one bike at a time, what the manufacturer is barred from doing at scale. It's not a coincidence that this industry has grown as strict as it has, in direct proportion to how tightly the factory has been forced to comply. Every decibel the factory pipe loses is a decibel somebody downstream gets paid to sell back. So when a rider complains that a new Road Glide doesn't sound like the twin cam it replaced, they're not describing a company that lost its identity. They're describing a company that legally cannot sell them the version of that identity they actually want, not without risking another multi-million-dollar fine. The sound didn't disappear because Harley stopped trying. It disappeared because the version people are chasing is, at this point, functionally illegal to sell brand new. Everything else, the decatting, the aftermarket slip-ons, the forum threads with 4 different mufflers tried and rejected, is just the ownership community doing, quietly and individually, what the manufacturer is legally barred from doing at scale. If you want to see where all of this is actually headed, you need to watch what happens when Harley stops fighting the noise fight altogether. Because that future is already rolling off the same production line, and it's the exact opposite of everything we just talked about. Older platforms, built before the Milwaukee-Eight, and before the tightest rounds of EPA compliance, sidestep almost every problem covered here simply by predating it. No 4-valve heads to fight, no integrated catalytic converter choking the header, and in plenty of cases, engines simple enough that a rider can service and tune them in a home garage for decades without ever touching a dealership. That's the story we get into in These 13 Bulletproof Harleys Will Outlast Every New One. Because the bikes that outlive their warranties tend to be the same ones built before any of these regulations existed in the first place. And understanding why they lasted tells you everything about what's changed since.